Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil as they follow the road laid out by the American pageant, occasionally taking unexpected turns to explore the side paths history often hides.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking back at 17th century colonial America. It was really a foundational time, but things developed very differently depending on where you were.
That's right. We're going to focus on two key areas. The Chesapeake colonies, think Virginia and Maryland, and then New England, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, places like that.
And despite starting as English settlements, they really went down quite different roads, didn't they?
They absolutely did. Understanding why is crucial, I think, for understanding a lot of later American history. The groundwork was laid very early on.
So our goal here is to dig into those core differences in that first century. What really shaped these unique societies? Let's start with the Chesapeake. What was life like there for the first English settlers? It sounds like it was pretty rough.
Oh, exceptionally rough is probably an understatement. The biggest challenge early on was just staying alive. Death rates were incredibly high.
Why so high? What were the main causes?
Mostly diseases they weren't prepared for. Malaria, typhoid, dysentery were rampant. And new arrivals went through this often fatal seasoning period, just trying to acclimate.
You read accounts like George Percy's from early Jamestown, and it sounds horrific. Disease, starvation.
Exactly. And then there was the winter of 1609, 1610, the starving time. Just devastating famine. Survival was really touch and go.
Do we have figures on life expectancy back then?
We do, and they're stark. For white men, maybe low to mid-40s on average, often lower in the earliest years. For women, it was frequently even shorter, sometimes under 40.
And for children?
Tragically high mortality. Some estimates suggest maybe half of all children didn't make it to adulthood. It's hard to fathom today.
Wow. Living with that level of death all around you, how did that shape the society?
It created what some historians call a culture of mortality. Family life was constantly disrupted. Marriages often ended quickly, not through divorce, but death may be lasting less than 10 years.
So lots of widows, widowers, orphans.
Yes, and frequent remarriages, complex stepfamilies. It also meant population growth was really slow. They absolutely depended on constant new immigration from England just to maintain numbers.
You mentioned women often died young, but I also read that the high male death rate sometimes changed things for women who survived.
That's a really interesting point. Because there were significantly more men than women, and men often died first, the typical English patriarchal structure didn't always hold up in the same way.
How so?
Well, a widow actually gained a specific legal status feme sole. This meant she could legally own and manage property, which married women under English law couldn't.
So a measure of independence, at least temporarily.
Yes, and with women being relatively scarce, widows often had good prospects for remarrying, potentially improving their economic standing. It's a complex picture, but it shows how the harsh reality could shift traditional norms, at least for some.
Okay, so survival was paramount. But what drove the economy? What were they doing there, besides trying not to die?
The answer, overwhelmingly, became tobacco. Around 1612, John Rolfe introduced a variety of tobacco that Europeans really liked.
And that took off.
It exploded. Exports to England climbed rapidly. Tobacco basically became the Chesapeake's gold. The whole economy revolved around it.
But growing tobacco isn't easy on the land, is it?
No, it's incredibly nutrient depleting. So planters were constantly needing new land. This land hunger was a major factor.
How did that affect settlement patterns?
It led to a very dispersed pattern. Instead of compact towns, you had plantations spread out, usually along rivers or waterways. That was crucial for transporting the bulky tobacco crop. Accounts from the time, like Lord Baltimore's or Augustine Herman's maps, really show this spread-out landscape.
And tobacco needs a lot of workers. Where did the labor come from initially?
For most of the 17th century, the answer was indentured servitude.
Can you remind us how that system worked?
Sure. Typically, a young person, usually a man from England, would sign a contract, an indenture agreeing to work for a planter for a set term, maybe 4 to 7 years.
And in return?
They got their passage paid to America, plus room and board during their service. And theoretically, at the end, they received freedom dues, maybe some tools, clothes, perhaps a little land, though that became less common.
It sounds like a potential opportunity, but I gather the reality was often quite different.
It was often incredibly harsh. The work was demanding, conditions were poor, and the same high mortality rates applied to servants. Many didn't even live to see their freedom.
And what happened to those who did finish their term?
That became a growing problem. By the later 1600s, you had this increasing class of freedmen, but many were landless and poor. Land was becoming harder to get, and they often lacked political rights, too. For instance, the Virginia Assembly restricted voting rights for landless freemen in 1670.
So a lot of discontent brewing.
Definitely. And that discontent boiled over in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion.
That seems like a really pivotal moment. Tell us about that.
It was led by Nathaniel Bacon, a planter himself, but it drew support from a really diverse group: frustrated frontiersmen, angry about conflicts with Native Americans, poor farmers, landless freemen, indentured servants, and even some enslaved Africans.
A cross-racial alliance, then.
Yes, and that was deeply alarming to the ruling elite. The rebels were protesting various things: economic hardship, Governor Berkeley's perceived favoritism towards the established planters, and his policies on Native Americans, which some felt weren't aggressive enough.
What did the rebels actually do?
They attacked indigenous communities, defied the governor's authority, and eventually marched on Jamestown and burned much of it to the ground.
But the rebellion eventually failed.
It did.
Yeah.
Bacon died suddenly, likely of dysentery, and the movement collapsed. But the impact was profound.
In what way? How did it change things?
For the planter elite, it was a terrifying glimpse of potential class and racial solidarity among the lower orders. It convinced them that relying on a large population of potentially restive white indentured servants and freedmen was dangerous.
So this pushed them towards a different labor source.
Exactly. Bacon's Rebellion is seen as a major catalyst in accelerating the shift away from indentured servitude and towards race-based hereditary African slavery.
That's a crucial connection. It wasn't just about economics, but about social control.
Precisely. The elite saw enslaved Africans as a more permanent, more easily controlled labor force, one less likely to find common cause with poor whites. After the rebellion, you see a deliberate effort to create stronger legal and social divisions based on race.
Let's delve deeper into that transition to slavery. You mentioned the problems with indentured servitude after Bacon's Rebellion. Were there other reasons it declined?
Yes, several things came together. Back in England, economic conditions actually started improving somewhat, meaning fewer people felt desperate enough to sign an indenture. Wages were rising there.
So the supply dried up a bit.
Right. And the Chesapeake had gained this grim reputation disease, hard labor. It wasn't as appealing. Plus, as we discussed, the planters themselves were becoming wary of creating this large class of potentially troublesome freedmen. And the cost of indentured servants may have been rising too.
Which made enslaved Africans seem like a more controllable investment from the planters' perspective.
Exactly. Enslavement was for life. It was hereditary, passed down through the mother, and racial difference was used to justify stripping away rights and enforcing control. They were seen as a permanent, stable, exploitable workforce.
And this is happening as the transatlantic slave trade itself is expanding.
Yes, the timing aligns. While the very first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, the numbers started increasing significantly in the later 17th century.
Was there a specific reason for that increase then?
A major factor was the end of the Royal African Company's monopoly on the English slave trade in 1698. That opened the door for more private traders, competition increased, and the volume of Africans forcibly transported went up dramatically.
Where were these people taken from?
They came from diverse regions across West and West Central Africa, bringing varied languages, cultures, and skills. But they were all subjected to the horrors of the Middle Passage, the brutal journey across the Atlantic.
It's almost impossible to comprehend the scale of that forced migration and suffering. As more enslaved Africans arrived, how did the laws in places like Virginia adapt?
This is where we see the deliberate legal construction of race and slavery. Early on, the status of Africans might have been a bit ambiguous. Some might have been treated like indentured servants initially, but that changed, especially after Bacon's Rebellion.
So the laws became more explicit.
Very much so. Lawmakers actively created a system, what we call racial codification, to define people based on descent, specifically African descent, and tie that directly to enslavement. They passed laws to systematically strip away any rights Africans might have had and cemented the idea of hereditary bondage.
Can you give some specific examples of these laws from 17th century Virginia?
Sure. You see it starting early. Around 1639-1640, there's a law differentiating who could be armed, specifically excluding Black people. And the John Punch case around then is one of the first documented instances of a Black man being sentenced to lifelong servitude, unlike the white servants involved with him.
So distinctions were being made very early on.
Yes. Then a huge one was in 1662, partus sequitur ventrum. This Latin phrase means offspring follows the womb. It established that a child's status, free or enslaved, was determined by the mother's status.
Which meant children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved regardless of the father's status.
Exactly. It locked in hereditary slavery and also dealt with the awkward issue, for the planters, of children born from the sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white men. Those children were now legally enslaved property.
What about religion? Did becoming Christian offer a path to freedom?
Initially, maybe there was some ambiguity, but a 1667 law clarified that baptism did not change an enslaved person's status. Religion and civil status were firmly separated.
And the power of the enslaver.
Laws increasingly reinforced it. A shocking law from 1669 stated that if an enslaver killed an enslaved person during correction punishment, it wouldn't be considered a felony. It gave masters immense power, essentially life and death, with minimal legal consequence.
That's chilling. It really institutionalized violence.
Absolutely. Then in 1670, another law prohibited Black people and Native Americans from owning white indentured servants, further cementing the racial hierarchy. In 1680, an act for preventing Negroes' insurrection severely restricted enslaved people's movement, their right to assemble, even their ability to defend themselves. It was legal terror, really.
And it continued to escalate.
Yes, 1682 saw laws broadening the definition of who could be enslaved, often lumping Native Americans and Africans together. And a key act in 1691 did several things. It increased punishments for runaways, made it much harder for owners to free enslaved people, manumission, and outlawed interracial marriage between whites and Black or indigenous people, using the term white explicitly in law to enforce racial purity.
So these weren't just reactive laws. They were actively building a specific kind of society.
Precisely. This was social engineering through law, designed to create and maintain a permanent, controllable labor force based entirely on race and a social hierarchy to match.
How did that hierarchy look by the end of the 17th century in the South?
It was becoming quite stratified. At the very top, you had the planter elite, a small percentage of the white population, but they controlled a vastly disproportionate amount of the land, wealth, and political power.
Where did their wealth come from?
Primarily large-scale farming of cash crops like tobacco, fueled by enslaved labor. The headright system also helped them accumulate land. Some were involved in trade, milling, law, land speculation, but land and enslaved people were the foundation.
And they dominated politics.
Completely. They controlled the colonial assemblies, like Virginia's House of Burgesses, the county courts, even the local Anglican church vestries. They consciously tried to live like the English gentry, building large plantation houses, engaging in leisure activities, and using hospitality and patronage to cement their status.
What about the rest of the white population?
Below the elite were the small landowners, the yeoman farmers. They worked their own land, maybe with family help, perhaps owned one or two enslaved people. Their economic position could be quite precarious.
And below them?
You had the landless whites. This group included former indentured servants who hadn't acquired land, tenant farmers renting land, wage laborers. Their opportunities for moving up were pretty limited, especially as the planter class consolidated land and relied more on enslaved labor.
And at the very bottom?
Enslaved Africans. Legally defined as property, chattel, with no rights, subjected to the absolute authority of their enslavers. Their forced labor quite literally built the wealth of the planter class.
And you mentioned Bacon's Rebellion actually reinforced this structure.
Yes. Ironically, instead of leading to reforms that might have helped poor whites, the elite responded by doubling down on slavery and emphasizing racial divisions. They consolidated their own power by driving a wedge between poor whites and enslaved Black people, making future cross-racial alliances much less likely.
Let's talk about women within this Southern society. How did their status evolve?
Well, for white women, English common law, especially the idea of coverture, where a married woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband's, was the baseline.
But we talked about the early Chesapeake mortality rates giving widows some temporary power.
Right. In the early, unstable decades, high male mortality meant frequent widowhood, and the feme's sole status offered some agency. Women's labor was also absolutely crucial then, sometimes even working in the fields alongside men.
Did that change as the century went on and slavery became more entrenched?
Yes, particularly for the elite. As reliance on enslaved labor grew, gender roles for white women, especially planter-class women, became more rigidly defined around the domestic sphere, managing the household rather than field labor. There was a growing emphasis on white women's supposed refinement and domesticity.
Was there a legal aspect to this distinction?
There was. A Virginia law from 1643 is quite telling. It made African women tithable, meaning their labor in the fields was taxed, just like men's. White women generally weren't taxed this way, signaling an expectation that black women would perform agricultural labor while white women ideally would not. Though, of course, for poor white women, domestic work often included strenuous farm tasks.
So womanhood itself became racialized.
Very much so. Elite white womanhood was associated with purity, domesticity. Black womanhood was defined by forced labor and, crucially, reproduction reinforced by that 1662 Partis law, making their children property.
Facing this incredibly oppressive system, how did enslaved people resist? Did they just endure it?
Absolutely not. Resistance was constant, even if it often had to be subtle. There were overt forms, of course. Running away was common, though forming lasting maroon communities was difficult in the Chesapeake terrain. There were occasional conspiracies or revolts, though perhaps less frequent or large-scale in the 17th century Chesapeake compared to later periods or other regions. Physical confrontations certainly happened too.
What about less visible forms of resistance?
These were probably more common day to day. Things like pretending to be sick, working slowly, intentionally breaking tools or damaging crops, theft of food or goods, even resisting reproduction using herbal knowledge for contraception or abortion. And in the most tragic cases, infanticide could be acts of defiance against a system that treated people as breeding stock.
And beyond individual acts, what about community and culture?
That was vital. Enslaved people built resilient communities and kinship networks, often creating surrogate families when their biological families were torn apart by sale. This offered crucial emotional and practical support.
And culture itself became a form of resistance.
Definitely. They forged a new African American culture, blending traditions from their diverse African origins with elements of their new environment. This process, sometimes called creolization, was powerful.
What kinds of cultural elements survived or were transformed?
Things like religious practices, blending African spiritual beliefs with Christianity, leading eventually to unique forms like the Black Baptist Church, while some also retain elements of Islamic faith brought from Africa. Music was huge, call and response patterns, drumming traditions, though often suppressed, dance, storytelling, specific ways of cooking, naming children after relatives or with African names. All these help maintain identity and resist dehumanization.
It's so important to remember that resilience and the creation of culture, even under the most brutal conditions. We've covered a lot about the Chesapeake, its deadly beginnings, the tobacco boom, the shift from indenture to slavery, the hardening of racial lines and social hierarchy, and the resistance of the enslaved.
It really lays the groundwork for understanding the unique trajectory of the Southern colonies.
Indeed. Next time, we'll shift our focus northward and explore the very different world that was taking shape in 17th century New England. It offers quite a contrast.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes. Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.